A little bit about going back to the basics. Pollution prevention makes a big difference, and much of our MS4 general permit is focused on pollution prevention, and I think has been lost a little bit in the kind of fondness for green stormwater infrastructure and engineered controls. But I think it's a complementary part of any program and very important to kind of the future of what we plan to do in our watersheds, in your watershed and in other watersheds that have nutrient related impairments. So I think for agenda, just a little bit of background, probably a little more focus on the Charles River than maybe you all would like, but I know some of you are in both watersheds. I'll talk a little bit about where the kind of the research is and where it continues to be related to kind of street cleaning and organic debris deposition, or cleaning of organic debris deposition. What we think the benefits are of doing that based on the science. I'm going to share some slides that have come from a few other projects. Recently completed a project in Dover, New Hampshire for that community and related to kind of Great Bay in partnership with New Hampshire DES and the University of New Hampshire Stormwater Center. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the outcomes of that study and pilot. And then really kind of talk about, like, from my perspective, where we're at right now with this particular part of our compliance program. And many of you, being operators or managers of programs, probably know a lot more about street cleaning than I do, but it would be good to get some insights from maybe some of you towards the end of the call. So that's my plan. Hopefully that works for folks. See, I have this toolbar up here. I want to get rid of it. You guys aren't seeing it though, right?
Correct. We
But
don't
we're
see it.
not.
Yeah, it's kind of right in my title. But anyway, nutrients are a huge topic in EPA Region 1, have been for some time. It is largely the pollutant of concern for stormwater as dictated by the region and based on impairments that we have in many of our water bodies. Both related to kind of historic industrial and municipal sources of wastewater, but also combined sewer overflows, and increasingly in understanding that stormwater is a pretty significant contributor to nutrient loading in any of these watersheds, which tend to be the kind of poster childs of EPA Region 1 nutrient management regulatory requirements. This is not news to any of you, but as we have increasing nutrients are not a bad thing. They're a very important thing to life on the planet. But as they increase in quantity and in concentration in water bodies, they can contribute to ecological stress and have historically contributed to fish kills and other problems related to dissolved oxygen as you get kind of an excess of biological activity and then decay. So we often see rivers and ponds and lakes in our region that look this color in June, July, August, and many of you probably have some of these issues in your own communities. And obviously, this is part of what we're trying to solve in general with our stormwater and clean water programs. So as many of you are aware, and some of you are in this watershed, the Charles River TMDLs, two of them, have been dictating regulatory requirements in the MS4 general permit in Massachusetts, really precedent setting from my perspective and for others that work outside of this region. The waste load allocation elements of the MS4 general permit that obligate communities to meet a certain reduction of stormwater-based nutrient load is fairly precedent setting across the country. The obligations for many communities are quite large, and the timeline on which to deal with them is pretty short. So this is definitely contributing to some angst and anxiety within this watershed. I work with a number of communities here. And there are strategies that EPA has dictated for us related to structural and non-structural approaches to management of phosphorus, primarily in stormwater runoff. And for those that aren't familiar, that little timeline on the bottom is kind of where we're at. So 2028 is a big year. for communities to meet it's actually 20% load reduction by 2028 or 2026, I'm sorry, and then 25% by 2028. So we're right up against a first regulatory deadline this year in the Charles River watershed, where communities are supposed to be demonstrating that they have a 20% load reduction associated with their stormwater. These are some numbers based on kind of the first 10-year requirements, so 2028. And I'm not picking on any of these particular towns. I don't know if Dedham's on. I think maybe Susanna was on earlier and said hi. But so I'm not picking on any communities. These numbers are just kind of taken from the permit just to demonstrate some of the ranges of load reduction requirements that communities have to meet. Communities that have less watershed area or less developed area in the watershed have less of a target to reach in that first 8 and 10 years. But you can see Newton's is quite high. They're one of the largest in the watershed, and there are several others in the lower portion of the watershed that are in the similar range. And for folks that have been involved in this kind of work and have been looking to design, bid, build, and operate stormwater controls that will reduce nutrient pollution, the planning level cost that a lot of consultants and engineers are using is that it's about $50 to $100 or $200,000 per pound for a structural control. And so what that means, if you do the math quickly in your head, is a lot of dollars if you're going to address this using structural control retrofits, largely on public properties that you all as managers of municipal programs have control over. And so this work was commissioned by the Charles River Watershed Association a couple of years ago to get some idea of what the implications of the TMDL and the TMDL related requirements are in the MS4 general permit. And you can see for the full kind of implementation over 20 years, which is what's written into the MS4 general permit, that the cost will be fairly significant for communities, individual communities. You can see Newton, it's kind of down central there next to Boston at somewhere around $200 to $500 million projection for cost related to kind of structural control retrofitting. So watershed wide for the Charles, we're probably looking in the billions of dollars of investment. And as you all are probably very well aware, most communities are not ready to make this kind of financial commitment and are figuring out how they're going to accomplish that if they are going down the road of primarily structural implementation, which is what EPA has provided as kind of primary guidance for us. So kind of welcome pollution prevention. Here's the headline of this. And the foundation of the MS4 general permit in the control measures are largely pollution prevention programs, right? We're trying to keep things out of the stormwater before it becomes something that ends up in our water bodies. And I've been doing this work a long time and have been working with communities for a very long time. And a lot of times we would look at those permit requirements, those controls, and we would say, does this do anything or not? And what I will tell you is most of those controls do quite a bit of work. And in 2016, a study in the upper Midwest was published, and there's a little reference down in the lower right to Bill Selbig's work. Bill still continues today to do work in the upper Midwest, and I'll share some of those findings. But this was pretty groundbreaking insight, at least it was for me. When I saw this presentation, I think in 2018 in Portland at an ASCE conference, it kind of blew my mind. I really had no idea that in, medium and high density residential or medium moderate density residential, that the majority of the nutrient load on an annual basis is from organic material deposition. And when I talk about this stuff, and many of you maybe already know this or have heard about these studies, trees are not bad. Trees are a good thing. Urban street trees are really good. Urban heat island issues, other things, just green space and But when leaves fall on pavement, that is different from the natural cycle of leaves falling on soil in a forest, right? Where nutrients can be recycled more readily. So when leaves fall on pavement, they become a source of nutrients. It's organic material, and it is common sense that what is contained in that organic material can become a pollutant when it's routed via MS4 and stormwater drainage systems. So what Bill's work did is looked at paired watershed. That's the little image on the right. So that's a typical, kind of academic approach as we look at two different watersheds. One's a control and one is our kind of base. And what they did is they did a very aggressive campaign over one fall to remove pretty much all of the organic material from the neighborhoods that they were working to demonstrate the kind of benefit or the difference between the control and the test watershed. So this is probably unrealistic for most municipal managers, and many of the communities in the upper Midwest kind of have been experimenting with this. I'll share a slide in a moment of that. But this provides us with a nice baseline. And what the results of this study showed was that in the test watershed, where they were doing this pretty aggressive removal of organic material, that they could, again, reduce about 60% total load over the course of a year. And for those of you that haven't necessarily paid that much attention to the Charles River requirements or the Mystic River requirements in the draft MS4 permit, 60% is largely the target that we're trying to meet for many communities. So what this does for somebody like me is I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, like we could probably make a significant impact on water quality in the near term by implementing this type of work. It takes labor and resources and equipment, as kind of demonstrated by the study. No one's going to go out every day with leaf blowers and pick up every leaf. We know that's not going to happen. So we're probably not going to get to 60%, but some percentage of that is very likely and will make a difference immediately to water bodies that we care about. A really interesting study, if you want to look at it. There's been several other subsequent studies that have followed. And they still, to this day, in Madison, Wisconsin, are doing empirical evaluations for kind of more common types of controls and management scenarios for street cleaning. But you can see the big spike in concentrations in the fall, and this is something that we see in our data locally as well. Like you can get up and over 1 milligram per liter of total phosphorus in your stormwater discharges during that time when leaves are on the ground. And these are some slides borrowed from Madison. The managers in Madison are really quite aggressive about what they're doing, and they're all in on doing this work. They've recognized the value of it. And I thought this was kind of a nice little demonstration. Again, like leaves aren't bad, trees aren't bad, but when they fall on pavement, they become a source of nutrients. And it's a high dissolved source of nutrients, which is very hard for us to accomplish treatment for in conventional stormwater controls. We can do a decent job with solids, but solids tend not to be the major problem for our receiving waters either, right? A little grain of sand, which can be digested and turned into total phosphorus, is really not a major problem for our water bodies. The dissolved constituents are largely the concern. So in Madison, through a variety of engagements over many years and street cleaning approaches, they've done a lot of different types of things, used a lot of different types of equipment. What they are demonstrating is that with a variety of equipment, they can get anywhere between 40 and 80% reduction of the fall load, which is an overall percentage of total. So you have to multiply 60% by 50%, and you get somewhere around, say, 30% of your annual load by conducting street cleaning operations the way most municipal managers would be able to accomplish it, which is not what GS did, but it's something that's more reasonable. Weekly, couple times a month, some frequency that's accomplished at the local level. So 30 or 40% load reduction is still a massive number, and would save communities in the Charles, in the Neponset, in the Mystic, a lot of money in capital expenditure related to stormwater control implementation. And again, I'm a big fan of green stormwater infrastructure, been involved in many, many years of implementation. This is not me saying we just do prevention and solve our problems, but it's a complementary program that needs to be recognized by EPA Region 1 in order to be incentivized for communities to do the work. Just another way to kind of look at this, there's a couple different SOPs that they use in Madison. I think the important take home for you all and what we've learned through a variety of work, including the Dover, New Hampshire work, and a lot of talking with Midwestern communities primarily around how they go about doing street cleaning. And I use those words very specifically because it's not always sweeping. It's a variety of equipment that's being used to pick organic material up off of streets. Many of you that do this work and know this work know that mechanical brooms tend to work best, or some other kind of tool that allows you to get at smashed and wet leaves. Vacuum sweepers are great for fine particulates and other pollutants of concern like metals and other things, but they're not great for leaf litter cleanup in all cases. So our thinking about what tools to use for fall cleanup is maybe a little different than what we've been thinking about related to the efficacy of sweeping for other pollutants of interest. So I'm going to run through a few slides on like what we did in collaboration with the PrEP folks. This was funded by the Great Bay 2030. They're very focused on nitrogen as a pollutant of concern for the Great Bay estuary. But the same applies for nitrogens in leaves as well. So there was a desire in Dover and in the Great Bay to kind of think about some kind of regional partnership and potentially a regional investment in equipment to accomplish some of these kind of activities like fall leaf litter deposition removal and other cleanup. And so we worked collaboratively with the city of Dover to conduct a couple little studies to kind of figure out the cost benefit based on numbers that Dover provided, and look at what might be possible if they were to expand it into neighboring communities that weren't under the same regulatory obligation that a city like Dover is under. So neighboring communities don't have the same kind of MS4 permit requirements or the same wastewater treatment requirements as some of the other communities in the Great Bay. And so there's credits available, if you will, by mobilizing on a more regional basis. One community could offset their requirements by going into a neighboring community. And I know that's a little heresy for New England folks, where we don't like working across town boundaries, but it is something that is increasingly being considered because of the need to reach nutrient control targets that are very difficult to reach. So for folks that aren't familiar, there was an expert panel commissioned by Piscataqua Regional Estuary Partnership and the UNH Stormwater Center. They got a grant, they brought in a facilitator, and they published the Clean Sweep Technical Memo. And what this did is it brought people in from the Midwest and New England. A bunch of experts, both on the academic and the operational side. USGS was involved. And they came up with two additional options, two different crediting scenarios that differ from what's currently in the MS4 general permit, which I'll go over in just a sec. But these are essentially, from my perspective, the most advanced crediting policies that we have. I'll point out what I feel like are some limitations to these, but these are two options they've published. EPA Region 1 has approved the use of these credits in the Great Bay. There's a letter from EPA Region 1 kind of approving the use of both of these. For those that are familiar, and for people that paid attention to the draft MS4 general permit, in Massachusetts, EPA chose not to allow option 1, which is a measured credit, but only to allow option 2, which still does have some limitations, which I'll point out. But it's better than what we have now, but it's not ideal. So the MS4 general permit currently, both in New Hampshire and Mass, do provide credits in Appendix F, and those are relatively low from my perspective, nowhere near like say 20-30%, which is what we think we can actually accomplish based on the science. So these are relatively low and they differ a bit each one. This is the sweeping credit. So if you sweep, and if you sweep at this frequency, these are the load reductions you get: 1, 2, 3, 8, 5, 10%. And that's for the impervious area you swept. That's not watershed-based load. The work by the USGS was based on catchment area. So that's inclusive of everything that comes off the landscape, not just what comes off the roadway. And so those 30 and 40% are quite a bit larger than, say, a 5% of just the impervious area that you're sweeping. So there's some differences there as well. And if you all have looked at these are fairly aggressive. Maybe 2 times a year is something that communities accomplish. In some cases, communities are doing some additional sweeping. Many communities do. They do it for a variety of reasons, but consistent monthly sweeping is not common, and consistent weekly sweeping is almost impossible on a year-round basis. So getting to 10% is not easy to do, or even maybe reasonable operationally to do. The organic deposition credit is a little bit different. It doesn't necessarily dictate what type of equipment you use to do it. But where the rub here is once per week, September 1 to December 1. And so for most of you all in Eastern Massachusetts, there are no leaves falling on the streets on September 1st. And probably not until mid to late October do most of you see leaves falling on the streets. And this is like basic climate information, right? We know when leaf peeper time of year is, and in fact, in Wisconsin, that's what they use as kind of directive on when they start to conduct organic material cleanup. So this once per week, September 1 to December 1, is a major problem in our permit right now, because communities aren't going to go out, mobilize weekly to run sweepers around if there's nothing to pick up, right? It's a complete waste of money, time, and resources. And so that's one of the issues. And so back to my early comments about advocacy, we need to have flexibility on when we operate so that we can maximize value for the investment that you all have to make to do the work. So those are some of the issues that were identified. It's why UNH and the PrEP and the DES folks and EPA was involved with this expert panel work at the time. And the technical memo provides all the detail you'll need if you want to take a look at it. These 2 approaches are outlined. They're both relatively straightforward. So the measured approach is, hey, the leaves you pick up, if you have a volumetric estimate of those and you want to have pretty good oversight on and justification for how much you get, ideally you have a weight, but maybe you have a volume that you can convert to weight, and then you can convert that to a total load reduction associated with what you took off the street. And that's a fairly easy logic for most people to understand. If I pick a leaf up, that leaf no longer is going to be part of the pollutant load. I can measure what phosphorus is in that leaf based on other studies, and I can convert it to a load reduction. This tends to provide communities, if when you look at it, a fairly substantial load reduction. It's not 60%, but it's upwards of 20 to 30 or 40% total annual load reduction using the measured approach. And again, EPA Region 1, at least in the draft MS4 permit, they've justified why they don't think this is appropriate for a permit. I disagree with that, but that's kind of what's happened to date. We'll see what happens after comments are reviewed and responded to. The modeled approach is a little more similar and also has been deemed somewhat acceptable by EPA. And it follows similar to what the logic is in the permit now, but provides some additional kind of benefits. So under these, this is all from the technical memo. Under these scenarios, depending on what a community does, they can get up to about 25% load reduction, again, for the pavement that's swept. So it's a subset of the watershed load. It's a smaller amount, but still 25% is much higher than what we have today. So that's a movement in the right direction. It does talk about sweeping versus leaf litter collection. So that forces communities into a certain type of operational mode. Sweeping might make sense. Vacuum sweepers don't necessarily make sense. So unfortunately, that kind of came in here. And it still talks about kind of weekly, but it's a little less clear about like what time of year, not September 1 to December 1. It's like, when does it make sense for you all to do the work? Go do it, and what you pick up, you can model and get some like larger credit. So that's all been a good thing. It's it's very valuable that this work was commissioned and that we have a published document, and that New Hampshire, or at least the Great Bay watershed, has the ability to leverage these new kind of approaches to crediting. So in Dover, we did a kind of an interesting little study that DPW mobilized on essentially 2 days in November of 2024. They did about 3.5 miles of leaf litter organic removal. They did not use a sweeper. They used a front loader with a clamshell attachment, and that's how they attacked the organic material deposition that was on their 3.5 miles of streets. They targeted these streets because they thought these were areas of interest for them. We didn't do any pre-study to evaluate canopy cover or anything else, which can make a difference to like how much material you'll get. They calculated some of their time, labor, and equipment. I will say there's some significant limitations to these kind of cost estimates. But they did come up with like a cost per day of removal of material from those 3.5 miles of streets. And ultimately what that resulted in was about 27,000 pounds of leaf debris that was picked up, largely in one day. If you do the math on the load reduction for that work, and the total cost for that work of $2,000, I think, is underestimated. There's a lot of different ways you can do cost estimating, and this was just primarily labor and equipment, not overhead, fringe, other factors that would be likely to be a true cost. But either way, the cost benefit for total phosphorus was around $168 a pound. So that's a whole lot less than $50,000 a pound. Those conversions between costs on an annual basis versus a lifetime of a stormwater control, though, need to be kind of thought about, right? Because it's life cycle cost of a capital investment versus an annual cost of sweeping investment. You have to do this every year to get those nutrients removed, whereas with a capital investment, you don't necessarily have to do that. But $168 a pound is pretty attractive, and a couple days of work resulted in that cost benefit. And that $288 per lane mile was pretty consistent with many other communities in the upper Midwest that are aggressively doing this work for nutrient control. Somewhere around $300 a lane mile to go clean material off of your streets. These are just some additional numbers, but you can see the kind of the load reduction benefits of 3.5 miles of road, about 12 pounds of load reduction, which is a fairly significant number. So we also kind of went through and did some additional evaluation after the fact and did some analysis of canopy cover and streets. The goal was to identify streets that would be targets in future years to go get the maximum return on your investment of mobilization. And so streets that have more canopy cover obviously are going to have more deposition. And we were hoping to get some correlation between the numbers. Well, that work was never completed. They ran into some disposal related issues in 2025 and were not able to mobilize to do the work, but we still did the GIS analysis. And part of the benefit of this was like, hey, Dover, if you do all of your streets, or if you target the residential neighborhoods where most of the canopy cover is, because there's definitely streets in communities that don't have a lot of canopy, which means they're not going to have much leaves, which means you're not going to get much benefit under kind of a measured load credit. But the total projected miles for roads with sidewalks and curbing, which is very important in most communities, about 40 miles of roads in Dover that had sidewalk and curbing, and also were in residential zones, which with a fairly high canopy cover of say 30 to 50% or greater. And what's the potential for that? So for Dover, the total phosphorus reduction potential based on that pilot study is they could get around 60 pounds reduction if they were to go do street cleaning on all of those roadways, and about 220 pounds of nitrogen reduction. And that's not insubstantial. That's not an insubstantial number for folks that have been working on nutrients. Those are fairly sizable reductions. A little other case study from closer to home for me. I'm just down the river from this community, and this community conducts street cleaning operations not for nutrient control benefit, but for public health, safety, drainage, and aesthetics. And they do about 2,000 miles of cleanup a year. They have a pretty interesting operation, pretty unique to Auburn, where they go out with folks with leaf blowers. They blow everything off the Esplanade sidewalks into the street. They windrow it, and then they have an Old Dominion brush leaf mulcher that they come along and they suck all the leaves up. They mulch it. They throw it in the back of a truck, and then they take that and they compost it on site. And that's very important, that composting piece. No one outside of the New England region disposes of, as far as I know, disposes of organic material collected in the fall at a landfill. All of the upper Midwest communities compost, turn it into a value-added product, reuse it. Massachusetts and New Hampshire are uniquely set up under their solid waste rules to have to take all of that stuff to a landfill, which is a huge cost, and really landfills don't want organic material, and it's a problem. But Auburn does this work, and they do it because they want to. They don't do it because they have to, which is fascinating to me. So they're already investing pretty heavily in organic material removal, and probably many of you do the same. And that's what makes me excited about this work, is if operators and highway departments and public works want to do the work, we're going to get a lot more opportunity to accomplish goals than if it's something new and different and something that isn't currently being done by operations teams. There's some numbers there from Auburn, upwards of 100 pounds per year of nutrient removal. And again, not a regulatory requirement, but just something that they do. And this is what they get. And that's based on a measured load. So the intent of the work in Dover was to really look at regional collaboration. I don't anticipate for the Neponset or other watersheds that where everyone's regulated that it would matter too much to collaborate regionally, but I think there are some interesting opportunities there. I think for us to accomplish our water quality goals in New England, like without regional collaboration, we're not going to get it done. We managing on a town by town basis just doesn't really make sense. A pound of nutrient that comes out of a discharge in the city of Newton is very different than one that comes out of a discharge in Lexington, Mass, for example, and how it finds its way to the river. But that's a conversation for another day. But regional efforts don't generally happen in New England, but thankfully to watershed groups like yours, maybe we could envision a different future. Here are some of the big conclusions and takeaways, and I'm just going to kind of walk through these, but this kind of work, sweeping and cleaning, can result in substantial reductions, not just in Great Bay, but in any watershed, anywhere. You can use a variety of equipment to accomplish these goals. It's not just sweeping that picks leaves up, as to Auburn and many other communities in the Midwest are using a whole variety of things. The timing of street cleaning is best conducted during peak leaf fall, probably mid to late October and November. Again, Wisconsin has some interesting kind of guidance around that, that we would suggest, we all kind of think about when are leaves on the streets, what's going to be best for us to go pick them up in the kind of most efficient manner. Cost benefit is very, very good compared to many other stormwater pollutant abatement options, and provides other benefits to your community, like safety and also like drainage improvements, not just nutrient control. And targeting parts of your community where you have significant canopy cover is really very important, right? Because that's where you're going to have most of your deposition. And most operations teams know where these are already. Like, you don't need a consultant to do a big fancy GIS analysis. Most operators know where the leaves are, and where they need to go get them. But that can require some, targeted, kind of mobilization, which can be a bit of a pain in the neck for many operators. They'll just like, well, we just want to go do an area. We don't want to have to do this street and then drive across town and do that one. So every community has to come up with the approach that works best, obviously. So here are some of the like challenges, I think, is like what I've seen in many discussions with my clients and with other communities that are doing this work is it's not just having equipment and it will happen, right? You all know this. You guys are public works. You know how the world works in reality is you don't always have resources. You don't always have trained operators. You don't have people that know what they're doing. Equipment breaks, very difficult to plan sometimes. In addition to that, there are a number of like hidden costs that were not evaluated in the Dover pilot that I presented. Things like storage, temporary storage, disposal, which is a massive issue and hurdle right now in Massachusetts related to kind of sweeping in urban areas. And finding a path forward for that is going to be really important for all of us to kind of see the real benefits of doing this work. Obviously, training's huge. More detailed and comprehensive cost analysis is difficult to do, as you all know, but the more we understand of what the true costs are, the more we can make good decisions together about cost benefit. And I think that's still very important to do. Was some of the goal of the Dover work, but there's more to do there, I think. Again, disposal. Why are we not composting this material and turning it into a value-added product? The material that's on streets in the fall, if you can get after it pretty quickly, does include some trash, but it doesn't include a lot of the other pollutants that might be a concern in material that you're cleaning right now in your streets related to spring cleanup. Very different material in the spring than in the fall. And so we really need to kind of figure out a better way for reuse of this material. It's organic material. It's got nutrients in it. It's valuable. And some of what we identified in kind of the Dover and that watershed is like, maybe this would be better conducted by contractors. Like, if the community constantly gets in a bind every fall and can't get the work done, you're not going to get the benefit out of doing the work, obviously. And so would contracted efforts be, better, easier to do, and or more cost beneficial? And this is stuff that you guys as operators and public works think about all the time, right? How to balance those things. Some regional strategies might be helpful. Regional training, sharing of information. I mean, I think, Ian, I'm kind of looking at you now, but like, one of the big roles of a group like yours is just information sharing. Like, hey, how are we getting it done? Like, what works for you, Jason, in Dedham versus what's working for me over in Milton might be real different. But there's different ways to get this work done, and information sharing is invaluable, as most of you already know. And then we had a couple specific recommendations in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire DES is kind of on this right now. They've hired a separate contractor to really look at solid waste and work with solid waste to come up with an appropriate strategy for disposal or reuse. some of this kind of idea of like contracting at a regional scale. Is there some cost benefit to doing that? And the Great Bay communities are looking at kind of intermunicipal agreement for the potential to mobilize contractors and or community resources into neighboring communities. And that does happen in Vermont, you all, that like there's communities that are sharing equipment. And I know that seems like crazy talk, but it is something that does happen in some parts of New England. So I think with that, I just kind of end with this. From my perspective, this is, the path for cleaner water, like, next fall. Like, we don't have to wait. It's not going to take 6 years to design, build, construct something. It's something that like communities are doing now. You can figure out how to play around with this. Many of the Charles River communities where I work, the operations teams are kind of exploring lots of different strategies around this. But again, if it's not incentivized in the permit, you guys, like, why would communities invest? And if we get 1% load reduction, the numbers are ridiculous, right? So in some communities where we're trying to estimate load reductions, we're at like 2 pounds a year based on current crediting program, as opposed to what is actually probably happening, which is on the order of 60 or 100 or 120 pounds. So right now, the credit policy just is really not amenable to promoting and incentivizing the investments communities need to make to get this work done. And that's a big issue. And hopefully, as a community of interested permittees and environmentally focused folks, we can come up with better solutions. And so that's pretty much what I have. And got about 13 minutes, I guess. I haven't been monitoring the chat, obviously, just talking. So if there's questions, Carrie or Ian, if you guys have been looking at anything or seeing anything from folks.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat, but does anybody have any questions for Zach?
Or challenge me on any of the
Yeah.
stuff that just came out of my mouth.
Yes, Rory McGregor from Sharon. Do pine needles fall into the same category, evergreen trees? We have a substantial population of evergreens in the Sharon community. Do we want to go after the pine needles as well as the leaves?
Yeah, Rory, it's an interesting question. And the folks in the Midwest have been kind of really getting into that. I think USGS is kind of looking at different species and like the different nutrient content of different species. And I don't have a good answer for you on pine. My guess is it's less, just being, smaller and also different constituent than like a big maple leaf. There definitely are different like nutrient contents of different leaves. In my mind, any of it would be beneficial. And this is part of EPA to defend them a little bit, their reluctance to give bigger credit here, because there are some factors like that just, we're just kind of converting all leaves into the same category and giving it a nutrient content, whereas there is differences in different species. So I don't have a great answer for you on pine needles, but my guess is it would be less beneficial. But again, from a health and safety perspective or drainage perspective, it might be useful.
Second question, the sidewalks adjacent to the roadways are oftentimes totally covered with leaf material. Is there any thinking about whether to catch that surface at the same time?
Yeah, and that's a limitation of the crediting policy, right? If you can't sweep it up on the curb to curb, you don't get credit for it. But you saw in Auburn, Maine, they're blowing the entire esplanade off, and there's a fairly substantial leaf load there, right? And that's actually where the health and safety stuff is, right? They become slippery when wet, and people on steep sidewalks can fall and really get hurt. So that's still something that needs to be accomplished in order to incentivize that type of activity, right? To get the credit that you're picking up. If it was a measured load, you could take some of the credit for that. But that gets into some of the gray area around the crediting policy, that right now it's really just curb to curb that EPA is offering the credit for. But there's no doubt that there's benefits to getting those leaves off sidewalks. Largely from a slip and fall hazard perspective.
And one final question, if we had a citizens effort to try and handle certain high density neighborhoods where we have significant leaf activity on major roadways. If we composted locally, that is in our neighborhoods, are we winning or losing? That is, we're putting it into landfills on our properties. Does that still create the problem because it'll eventually in the groundwater leach into the streams?
I think siting and locations of any composting facility or composting activity is obviously very important. And that's a challenge for many municipalities who are trying to deal with it right now. They don't often have they have big paved yards that they can store it temporarily, and then they have to wait to get it mobilized to a landfill. And so that's definitely a consideration, Rory. All good points. Good.
Okay, thank you.
Well done picking on some of the challenges in the easy approach I presented.
All right, I'm going to call on Jason and then Heather.
Hey, Jason.
Sorry, having trouble with the microphones. Zach, thank you for the presentation. Great information as always. Now, I could just points of clarification, just an understanding too, based upon the draft permit that's out. A lot of these things that we're discussing today probably won't be applicable, probably won't go through, but we don't know. Probably not, but it's probably something that's more geared towards with continued study to the next iteration, maybe 5, 6, 7 years beyond when they finalize this permit. Is there any way where other communities in Massachusetts can get involved in similar low-scale studies in this next iteration of the permit, like we did with the catch basin cleanings, in order to garner more information that can make it more feasible for communities to get extra credit? Because the non-structural controls are huge for communities, because you're using available forces. You're not having to contract and do things. So just curious to your thought process on that, first of all, other studies that can be done locally.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very strongly, and most of the clients that I work with agree with this, is that, and many of them already are conducting their own little studies, Jason, to let's look at cost effectiveness. Let's get our operators kind of trained up. Let's mobilize in certain neighborhoods. Let's see what we get. The benefit of the Neponset is that, and I see this with the other impaired waters that are not TMDL waters, is I'm advocating that we just start to report the credit that we think we're actually getting based on volume, and reference the expert panel work. You're not under the obligation, and EPA might debate me on this. If anybody's on the call, they can certainly debate it. But the references to the credits are all in Appendix F. That's TMDL waters. I don't see any reason why communities that are not subject to TMDL provisions couldn't at least demonstrate to EPA that, hey, we're collecting 25 tons a year. We have good justification for that: photos, documentation, weights before it goes to the landfill, or before disposal, because that's the only thing that many communities do with it. And you could demonstrate that you're getting a certain load reduction. Bigger picture, Jason, and I think for the Neponset folks, one thing that I'm really kind of personally advocating for is something in our region similar to what the Chesapeake Bay has, which is convened, ongoing convenings around expert panel work. We're not going to solve the needs in the Charles without looking at other alternatives. This is one of them. Conventional controls are another. We need a lot of different things to be able to solve the water quality issue. And right now we don't have an expert panel that's just available to debate the merits of these various things. And also to, Rory's points that he brought up, there's a lot of nuance to this, and we all have the same goal, which is clean water. There's different ways to go about it. We need to have, and I'd like to see EPA Region 1 be a leader here and help maybe fund it. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but we need a way to be able to discuss strategies and to get approval on those strategies in a timely manner, so that, Jason, you can dedicate resources, because you guys can't dedicate resources that don't have a proven effectiveness. And right now you have to rely on the crediting policy that's really 15 years old now. right? Because that's when the permit was initially drafted. So I'm a big fan for starting things and trying things and then defending those with the regulatory community. And we have good partners at EPA. I mean, I think we do. We just have to find time to work on these things, because we're not going to solve the problems in the Charles with the controls that we have at our disposal.
And I'll just take the last second for like more of an editorial based upon some of the stuff that we've been talking about today too. You know, a lot of this is great, and we need these innovative ways in order to find opportunities to maximize our load reductions, nitrogen, phosphorus wise, and whatever. Again, and the reality is, and I'm just using Dedham as my reference. DPW is comprised of like 16 laborers. So in order to do anything even close to what would be required under this, couldn't happen. We'd have to contract it. And even like when we see with the catch basin cleanings, there's only like one or two real companies out there that you can contract to do that type of work. So there's also a limited pool of contractors to get out there as well. I'm sure they're going to see the opportunity, and there's going to be more in the future because there's a need for it. But to go back on some of the things that you kind of overarchingly brought into this conversation is the regionalization, and I've always been a huge proponent of watershed-based regionalization. I think the state should push as hard as it can to regionalize all communities under their given watersheds and work as like a watershed commission on all the objectives that are within it, because we're all fighting against each other, and we're never going to be able to do what we need to do as individual towns and cities, because we're always fighting for the last dollar, or we're trying to make improvements just in our community where it might be more important to a neighboring community because their condition is worse to whatever's going on in the watershed. So, some of the things I'd like to see in the future is, yeah, it's great to push us to do all this water quality stuff, but also push us to form alliances in regional entities in order to actually be able to get more work done. And so that's just my editorial for today. But again, thank you, Zach.
Thank you. No, I'm on board, Jason. Like several years ago at a spring meeting for NAWIA, we invited a representative from a watershed management district in Minnesota, again, upper Midwest, to come talk to us about how they do that in Minnesota. Fascinating, but yeah, a long way to go on that. Hey, Heather, I think you had your hand up, so I'd love to give you a minute or two here if you have something.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the great presentation, Zach. I had a sort of comment / question with regards to some of the methodology used for the street sweeping. So the current MS4 permit, as well as the draft permit, generally speaking, have higher credits for phosphorus removal depending on the type of street sweeping. And so mechanical is actually a little lower than the vacuum sweepers, than the high efficiency regenerative air. So I thought that might be worth teasing apart a little bit, because the way I understand it is that it depends a bit on what's on your street at the time of sweeping. So if you're talking about, as you rightly pointed out, you've got your initial leaf fall, you've got a lot of intact leaves. Definitely those mechanical brooms are going to pick that material up a lot better. But my understanding is that as that material then breaks down physically, chemically, and you get more of the particulate matter, you actually get a higher percentage of phosphorus relative to, just a bunch of leaves, if you will. It has to do with the larger surface area of those molecules, and the phosphorus really tightly binds to the fine particulate matter. And at that point, unfortunately, a lot of it is the free reactive, bioavailable phosphorus. So I think at that point, now the vacuum, or even better, the regenerative air sweepers, pick that material up a lot better. So I guess my suggestion is that in an ideal world, municipalities would consider what's on the ground at the time of year that I'm actually sweeping. And I realize that some of this is pie in the sky, because not every municipality has access to a variety of different types of sweepers. But I would think that, if you might, if you had the ability, that you might want to focus on the broom sweeper early in the season, and then if later in the fall or when you're doing a spring cleanup, if you have the ability, then you might want to do the one of those other systems. So just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good point. And if you kind of look at this Madison slide, like many of the communities that are more advanced in the Midwest are using a combination of equipment. They'll do, and for leaves, again, like if it's dry deposition and sunny day, might be different than if it's been mashed by parking for a week and is a wet matter that has to be cleaned up. So it varies quite a bit. And I think what I've learned is it's usually a combination of equipment that communities need to deploy to actually get the most volume and probably have the most benefit. And that's certainly what Madison's doing. I mean, the benefit of all these communities in the upper Midwest is they're aggressive about it. They're spending lots of money on this work for a variety of reasons. And the case studies from there, which we published in that Dover report, are pretty fascinating. We did a lot of interviews with operators in the Midwest, and everybody does a little different. And there's different reasons why you want to mobilize different equipment at different times of year, for sure.
Well, thank you. I appreciate all the data and tying it back to the permit and what's realistic around here. Just a quick response to I've forgotten who asked about the pine needles, but yes, in general, conifers, evergreens do have lower phosphorus concentrations relative to deciduous plants. However, they still have a lot of phosphorus. So all things being equal, there's no real reason, practically speaking, I would think, to separate them. If you can clean it all the better. So thanks.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks. Larry, did you want to ask your question? I saw you put something in the chat. I can read it too.
If you want to read it, that's fine.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I just couldn't see you on the screen.
Yeah, I was. Hold on. Could street sweeping be increased just during the fall, like October and November, like leaf falling time? Because I sort of heard you mentioned throughout the year, but go with that.
The organic material removal associated with leaf fall would be just, those couple of months that you guys have it on the ground. And that varies every year a little bit. And it varies by tree species quite a bit, right? Maples come down first and then oak. But yeah, it would just be targeted to that fall. And so the crediting policy currently that is most relevant is really not the sweeping credit, but the organic material removal credit in the draft permit. Does that answer your question, or did I miss something?
Yep.
Yeah, definitely fall mobilization, and again, the material is very, very different than what you guys clean up, this time of year, which is mostly sand, trash, organics. Ian, I know we're out of time here. Over time, are you closing us up, or do you have another comment?
Oh no, we've got time.
I was just I thought your comment about the different incentives that municipalities face when they have all or a part of their town in a TMDL community versus an impaired waters community is a really interesting question. And I was just going to observe, we have a number of communities that kind of straddle the Charles and the Neponset, and we entirely understand why, but some of those communities have been pretty explicit about like, hey, I'm taking all my resources and going and working in the Charles because I got a TMDL I got to meet, and I don't have that in the Neponset. The irony from our point of view is that there really is very little functional difference between the water pollution in the Charles and the water pollution in the Neponset. It's really a reflection of historical investment and resources in pursuing regulatory designations, the willingness of the agency to designate impairments, undertake TMDLs, et cetera, that goes back many, many years. So an interesting wrinkle, your comment that in some respects, communities are at greater liberty to kind of innovate and just sort of do what works in a place where there is only an impairment. in a sense, they're kind of getting the full benefit of their efforts, right? And and one of the interesting things in my mind is just whether we should be thinking of this as hey, we can do this and we can get full credit for this in the form of the Neponset will not end up with a TMDL, and then we won't have to deal with this all later. But it's often, I think we're all, for understandable reasons, we're all typically in a pretty reactive mode, and without that regulatory, it's hard to anticipate the future yet to exist regulatory hammer as opposed to the regulatory hammer that has already come down. Anyway, just an interesting set of issues.
Yeah, I do think to your point that, and like I said, the impaired waters, we have a little more flexibility. We're not so hamstrung by kind of the prescriptive controls and control benefits that are outlined in Appendix F. Whether or not EPA would agree with that statement or not, I don't know. But right now, communities that just have impaired waters are required to do some kind of stormwater control retrofit demonstration, and then kind of report on load reductions. And where many of those communities are going is like, oh, well, we're doing this fall leaf litter cleanup anyway. Let's just go ahead and calculate what our benefit is and report that. And we can put an asterisk next to it, or in the notes can say, based on expert panel guidance from the clean sweep memorandum, and we don't have a load allocation one way or the other anyway, but it demonstrates, that a community is making an effort to reduce nutrient loads from its discharges. So, whether that's good or not, but I think the more EPA kind of sees and hears us talking about the benefit of this, and understanding that communities, they do have limited resources, and doing this work is not an easy undertaking, to kind of Jason's point, like the labor it takes, and the equipment it takes, and the investment it takes in repair and maintenance of equipment, is fairly substantial. And so if we don't have any kind of regulatory incentive to do it, it's harder to do. But like I said in the presentation, one of the things that really excites me about this is many communities do this irregardless of regulation, which to me is the holy grail of alignment between getting work done that you want to do and not work done that you have to do. That does provide environmental benefit.
Any other questions for Zach?
See, now that you did schedule it to noon, talk for 20 more minutes and be fine. Okay, we answered Lawrence's question.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Zach. That was very interesting. I'm looking forward to reviewing those slides again and your numbers. But I really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. I'm glad that you guys are. Neponset didn't come into the MS4 general permit, right? You guys didn't make the list. It's just the Mystic and the Charles still that have the regulatory load reduction.
Yeah.
But we do not have a phosphorus team yet. I mean, the communities obviously are covered by the permit, but
right. Yeah, it's interesting because Mystic now is, at least contemplated as having some load reduction targets as well.
Right. Got that alternate TMDL.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how things go. I do understand that EPA is currently working on response to comments. And Jason, to your earlier point, if you're still on, but and we have, on behalf of one community, submitted an alternative credit request based on all of this, both relief on timing and on the idea of like weekly, like let us do when it makes sense to do it. It might be twice a week or it might be once every other week, but like it's not necessarily like a weekly thing. So we have that submitted. They're going to respond to that. and the response to comments and make sure they're aligned, because they did get a lot of pushback on the crediting policy and not adopting the measured approach. And so we'll see where they land on that. I am hopeful that we'll have something a little better than what they put in the draft. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm hopeful that we will see something that provides a little more incentive for communities to kind of make some of the investments to try to get after this pollutant that's just sitting there on the pavement in the fall, that if we just picked it up, it wouldn't be as much of an issue for our water bodies. So guess I'll leave you guys with that unless there's anything else, and thank you for the time.
You.